Simulan na po natin. Ipakikilala ko na po ang ating first speaker. Yan. So, ang speaker ay graduate po ng BS Agriculture sa South Silupban, Quezon. And she recently finished her MS in Agriculture major in Cavite State University. Ngayon po ay isa siyang Science Research Specialist 1 sa Standards Development Division ng BAFS. So without further ado, let's welcome po Ms. Krisha Mecija.
Hello po, good afternoon po. So, ask ko lang po naririnig ako. Hello po. Okay naman po yung audio.
Hi, Ms.
Hi, Chris. Yes, naririnig ka na.
Okay po. So, thank you po. Thank you po for the introduction po. So, yes po. Okay po. So, hintayin lang po natin yung slide po. So, currently po, I am a Science Research Specialist 1 po under the Bureau of Agriculture and Fisheries Standards under the Standards Development Division. So, kaya po ako nagpe-present sa inyo kasi I am one of the project managers po handling the revision of different Philippine national standards related to cacao or cocoa beans. So, nandiyan na po ba yung presentation? So, okay po. So, wait lang natin. So, yun po. So, kaya po ako yung na-assign na mag-present sa inyo in order naman po to explain yung ating isa sa mga standards na related for cacao or cocoa beans, which is the PNS BAFS 104-2011 or the Code of Practice for Cacao Beans. Hintayin lang po natin yung slide. Yun po. So, bago po tayo mag-start, habang hinihintay din natin yung slide natin. So, I just want to introduce po that this presentation po is purely based po dun sa ating Philippine National Standards. So, as you can see po, so next slide po, I already introduced po what will be our topic for today. So, I just want to give you a brief background po pagdating dito sa ating PNS BAFS 104-2011. As you can see po, TWG means composition of the technical working group member. So as you can see po, this is crafted 2011 pa po. So I mean parang 9 years ago na po nung nakalipas simula nung na-draft and na-craft and na-approve po yung ating standard for PNS Code of Practice for Cacao and Cocoa Beans. So as you can see po, yung chair natin regarding sa pagka-craft or pagda-draft ng standard natin is si Mr. Edward F. David of Cocoa Philippines. And of course po, for the members po, the technical working group always includes different representatives from stakeholders, private industry, and of course government agencies that is related to the draft that to the standard that is being drafted or developed. So as BAFS po, the director that time po is si Director Gilberto F. Leyese, and Ms. Karen Christine A. Roscom po serves as the project secretariat po for the development of the PNS Code of Practice for Cocoa Beans. So next slide po. So baka nagtataka kayo kung ano ba yung standard or ano yung Code of Practice. So since ako yung nauna, so medyo i-explain ko din sa inyo kung ano ba yung standard. So standard is a documented agreements containing technical specification or other precise criteria to be used consistently as rules, guidelines, or definitions. Yun ay based sa ISO. So standards is voluntary. Nagigi lamang siyang mandatory once na ita-translate siya ng isang regulating body or regulating agency into technical regulations or guidelines. For example is the Organic Agriculture Standards that is being translated into a technical regulation. So yung standards na yun is kailangang sundin pag na-translate na siya or in-adopt siya ng isang regulating body. Like sa GAP din, pag magpapacertified kayo ng GAP sa inyong mga farms po, is nako-consider din po yung ating mga standards since may specific standards tayo for good agricultural practices. So for the code of practice po, code of practice is a type of standard. So it is a process standard. So it is defined as the production, processing, manufacturing, transport, and storage practices for individual foods or groups of foods that are considered essential to ensure the safety and suitability of food for consumption. That is based on codex. So, pag sinabing code of practice kasi, this refers to process standard. So, itong pinapresent ko po sa inyo ngayon is probably or is a type of process standard which that guides the producer on achieving a quality product. So dito sa presentation na ito, actually sa buong webinar, you will encounter two types of standard, which is the process standard na pinipresent ko ngayon for the code of practice, and mamaya yung specification and grading is a product standard. So for product standards, mainly tinatakal niya kasi is mga specifications and criteria for the characteristics of products. While yung process standards natin is criteria for the way the products are made. So this code of practice standards was drafted or crafted to guide the processors or farmers in order to achieving a quality product, which is yung for today is cacao beans. So hindi lang po cacao beans yung may code of practice. So if you go to our website po, you can see different types of code of practices standards, not only for crops but also for animals po and different non-food crops po. So next slide po. So, ano ba yung scope natin for today? Or ano yung scope ng standard natin? Pag sinabing scope, ito yung sinasabing saklaw. Or to what extent ba yung sakop ng ating standard for code of practice for cacao beans? As you can see po, dito sa scope natin for today is sakop niya yung GAP or Good Agricultural Practices. And of course, the quality in food safety, primarily for primary production, post-harvest operations, processing for fermentation and drying, storage and transport of fermented cacao beans, and of course, the prevention of contamination, specifically for microbial, physical, and chemical. So, ano ba yung objective nung ating standard? So, this provide general guidelines and technical advice on food safety and quality for the production, post-harvest, and processing of cacao. So, ang gusto nung standard nito na i-share sa mga magre-read or sa gagamit is to produce quality and safe cacao beans. So, dito sa standard na to, may encounter nyo later na palaging ine-emphasize yung palaging gamitin or laging i-emphasize yung hygienic practices sa farm. Not only for the product, but throughout the primary production hanggang sa transport and storage. So, to give a brief background po sa BNS, so this is crafted po kanina nung sinabi ko, 2011. But to give you an update po, the PNS BAFS 58, which is for cacao and cocoa bean specification and grading, was updated last year, last 2019 po. So, as you can see po, kung nabasa nyo na, kung may nakabasa na po sa inyo ng PNS BAFS 58, yung latest namin, which is available po sa aming website, is kung mababasa niyo po doon is kasama na yung unfermented beans. But for these standards po for COP for the cacao beans is wala pa po yung unfermented beans natin. So dito po, kaya po, as you can see po, medyo in-emphasize ko po yung sa scope natin is, ang scope niya po is for fermented beans lamang. So wala pa po dito yung mga practices for unfermented beans. So, yun nga po, these standards could be revised din po. We will conduct a table review regarding different updates, regarding sa different standards po related to cacao or cocoa products. And if to give you rin po an update, we are also revising din po the PNS for Philippine Tablea. So, yun po. So, lahat, para isa-isa lang po muna as of this moment po is currently is yung nire-revise po natin is the Philippine National Standard for Philippine Tablea. But as time goes by po or times passes by, syempre, i-consider din po na ma-revise din po itong ating COP for cacao beans since 9 years ago na po, and to accommodate na rin po yung different updates or technologies para sa PNS. So for the next slide po, wait lang po. Hello po.
Hi, Krish. Nagkaroon lang tayo ng konting technical.
Okay po. Okay po. So, wait lang po natin. So, sige po, to give you a background po dito sa ating PNS or doon sa mga PNS-related, cocoa or cacao-related standards, we are, unti-unti na po natin siyang ina-update to address the different updates po in technologies and of course, the practices din po. And of course, we are also considering din po, alam din naman na po namin yung mga nagpo-produce from unfermented beans. So, don't you worry po kasi baka mamaya isipin ng iba bakit puro sa fermented beans lang yung practices na nadi-discuss dito sa standards. So, yun po, to inform lang po the group that we are already revising po different cacao or cocoa-related standards po. So, just wini-wait lang po natin yung presentation po.
Siguro, Krish, tanong ko lang din, ilan
Yes
ba
po.
yung total standards natin with regards to cacao and tablet para pag visit, pwede siguro i-visit ng ating stakeholders yung ating website para makita yung ibang standards.
Okay po. So for ano po kasi, there are two product standards. So yung product standards related with the specification and grading po. So for Philippine Tablea, we have one. So existing pa po yung atin. So ongoing pa po kasing revision. And then of course, the specification for cacao beans which will be presented by Sir Val po later. And marami po kasi tayong code of practices. May code of practice tayo for cacao or cocoa beans which is I am presenting to you right now. And COP din po for Philippine Tablea, we have po separate. And then reduction po of ochratoxin A, and then traceability, and yun po yung mga nare-recall ko na related sa cacao since this is parang talagang yung commodity is industry-driven. So talagang marami tayong standard pagdating sa cacao or cocoa beans po. Not only cacao and cacao beans but also related products po which is tablea. So yan po. So bumalik na po yung ating presentation. So yun po. So yun po. So the scope, as you can see po, as I discussed din kanina, so yan po yung mga saklaw or sakop nitong ating Philippine National Standard for the Code of Practice for Cacao Beans. So for the next slide po. So yun. Ano ba yung purpose? So yung purpose kasi ng standard na to is of course for food safety. And of course for on-farm processing, fermentation, and drying. So next slide po. Ayan. So as you can see po, itong standards na to kasi is actually mahaba siya. So talaga I crafted this presentation para po in order na mas madali siyang i-present. So as you can see po, marami po kasi siyang provisions. So yung po nakikita niyo na mga green tabs and gray tabs is the provisions of PNS for cacao beans. As you can see po, yung mga green tabs po kasi, yun yung mga i-discuss ko sa inyo. Since yung mga fermentation and drying design, maintenance and sanitation, and personal hygiene was referred to the Codex Standards for principle of food hygiene. So just to inform the body po, the standards can refer po to other standards for reference po, like international standards like ISO, IFOA, and Codex Standards of course. So, for the next slide po. So, yun po. So, for the next po is yung primary production. As you can see po, one of the major provision po of ating COP is yung primary production. As you can see po, meron tayong environmental hygiene, water for primary production, farm establishment, farm maintenance, soil management and fertilization, pest management and crop protection, personal health, hygiene and sanitary facilities, handling and transport, cleaning, maintenance, and sanitation. So, just to be, baka po may nalilito sa inyo na parang pareha siya sa GAP. So, napapansin niyo po ba? Kung may mga nakakapansin na sa inyo na parang related siya or somewhat, parang parehas yung mga provisions niya pagdating sa good agricultural practices. So, ang good agricultural practices po kasi is under ng Code of Practice. So, standard din po siya, pero under siya na, parang type siya ng Code of Practice standards or process standards. So, for the environmental hygiene po, so next slide po. So for the environmental hygiene, farmers should evaluate their land and potential sources of contamination from the environment should be identified. So farmers should evaluate their land based on the following. So, one is previous and present usage and production area and the adjoining sites or the land history, access of farms and wild animals to the site and water sources, potential for contaminating cacao areas from leaking, leaching, and overflowing of polluted surface waters, and if available, environmental impact assessment. So dito sa environmental hygiene, hindi parang ine-emphasize lang dito sa ating provision dito na parang yung mga potential na contaminants sa environment is kailangang ma-identify. Hindi pwede na porket nakakita lang kayo ng pwedeng taniman is sige, tanim na tayo. Hindi po ganoon kadali. So, these standards recommended po na parang i-evaluate po muna natin yung pagtataniman natin, yung environment natin. So, yung unang-una nga daw po is yung land history. So, mamaya kasi naging pala siyang tambakan ng basura. So, prone siya sa mga heavy metals and other contaminants. So, kailangan po natin yung i-consider baka mamaya kasi hindi rin productive na pala yung lupa natin. So, sayang lang din yung mga investment na i-invest natin for inputs and saka sa seedlings. Of course, sa access of farms and wild animals po, so kailangan din nating malaman kung may mga neighboring farms ba tayo yung may pakawala na hayop kasi hindi natin alam baka mamaya pag pumasok sila sa farm natin, kainin yung mga tanim natin. So, 'di ba, parang matuturing na rin natin silang pest pag gano'n, pag nakaka-apekto na sila dun sa ating farm management. And of course, for potential contaminating cacao areas from leaking, leaching, and overflowing of polluted surface waters, and syempre kailangan din po natin i-check yung source, yung waters natin. Kasi baka mamaya, yung source ng water natin na sinusupply natin sa farm is parang contaminated or may possible na makontaminate dahil halimbawa meron palang pabrika na nagtatapon ng lason doon, hindi natin alam, di ba? So, kailangan natin i-evaluate. And if available naman po, EIA. So, EIA or Environmental Impact Assessment was administered by the Department of Environment and Natural Resources as well as the local government units. So, as you can see po, so for the LGUs po and DNR, sila po kasi nag-administer talaga pag kukuha tayo ng mga EIA or permit regarding po, if lalo na pag magsiset up tayo ng farm. So, yun lang naman po yung parang laman ng provisions natin for environmental hygiene. So, dapat maging conscious tayo and maging parang yung farmer, kailangan hindi porket nakakita ng lupa na pwedeng pagtaniman, yun na yun. So, dapat kailangan natin na may plano din tayo. And of course, kailangan natin isalang-alang din yung ibang factors na pwede maka-apekto dun sa ating farm. So, for the next slide po. So, the next slide po is the water for primary production. Of course, pag nagsiset up po tayo ng farms, kahit saan, hindi lang po sa cacao, is of course, kailangan natin na ma-identify yung primary and secondary sources of water. So the farmer should protect water sources against contamination and pollution. So for the farmers po, kailangan po na hindi lang po porket nakita nyo po na okay naman yung tubig, para magiging kampante na tayo. So the water sources po, so para ipoprotect din ng farmer sa possible contaminants po. So manure, fertilizers, and agrochemicals shall be handled and stored in a way that prevents contamination of water sources. So water should be assessed based on microbial and chemical safety, suitability for intended use. And the producers should also allow a strip or native vegetation or border or guard plants to grow along water sources to control erosion and filter out agrochemicals and protect wildlife habitats. So yun po, kailangan natin isaalang-alang yun na parang alagaan din natin na hindi makontaminate yung water, lalo na kung mapapakinabangan naman natin yung area natin na sa mahabang panahon para magtuloy-tuloy yung productivity. So next slide po. So farm establishment and rehabilitation. So as you can see po, may mga lugar tayo na pwedeng pagtaniman. So it's either existing coconut farms na pwede nating i-intercrop ang cacao, and agroforestry area, and of course the open area. So for the agroforestry areas lang po, so the land should be classified as agricultural land and or approved for agroforestry use. So hindi porket feeling natin or feeling natin na pwede magtanim doon kahit parang medyo magubat na siya is pwede na agad. So, dapat po is approved siya or classified as agricultural land or for agroforestry use. And for the open areas naman po, if planted on open areas, planting of permanent and temporary shade trees should be established a year before new cacao trees. This will shelter young plants. Of course, pag open areas naman po, so open talaga siya, walang ibang nakatanim. But para na lang rin po sa protection ng ating mga itatanim, of course, we need to establish a new, parang trees po a year before tayo magtayo ng cacao tree. So, hindi talaga siya pwedeng basta-basta magtatanim na lang tayo agad. So, for the agroforestry areas, of course, these standards, the degradation and deforestation is prohibited. So, next slide po. So, for the farm establishment and rehabilitation pa din po, so planting materials should be reasonably free of visible signs of pests and diseases, disease-tolerant, high-yielding, and good quality. So, ina-advise po or nire-recommend ng PNS na ito na syempre, pag gagamit tayo or bibili tayo ng planting materials, syempre, kailangan na natin i-ensure na syempre disease-tolerant siya, high-yielding, good quality, and reasonably free of visible signs. So, we know that there are different varieties of cacao. Siyempre, kung ano yung mas suitable sa lugar nyo, yun yung advisable. So, for the next slide po. So, for farm maintenance naman po, since natapos na tayo sa rehabilitation and establishment, nakalimutan ko lang po. So, for the newly established cacao farms po, so cacao tree should be planted in most suitable pattern po. So, para ma-ensure din yung management ng farm since nagsisimula pala and newly established pala. So, for the farm maintenance po, the farm should perform good cultural with the cacao farm. Proper pruning is an important operation that can affect yield, shape, and structure of the tree for the rest of its life. So, dito po sa standard na to, in-emphasize din po yung importance ng pruning. Since the pruning objectives po is yung increased cacao pod production, reduced pest and disease infestation, and easy access for harvesting and crop protection activities. So, of course, we all know naman po, para din talaga ma-increase yung cacao production, pruning also allows the entrance of sunlight, which is essential po for pollination and fecundation of the flowers and the growth of the pod. So, alam naman po natin na ang sunlight is related sa pamumunga. So, yun po, isa din po yun sa dahilan kung bakit talaga pinopromote po dito sa standard natin yung pruning, yung proper pruning. Is important dito sa ating operation. And if cacao trees naman po is less productive po, so rehabilitation should be done po, either by side grafting, bark grafting, or chupon grafting. So yung chupons or side shoots po, yung tawag ng iba. So the side grafting po, according din sa standards, so the side grafting, not lower than 3 inches from the ground is recommended. So a tree can have 3 side grafts, but these be made 1 month apart. So hindi po kailangan sabay-sabay. So dapat 1 month apart daw po. And the scion or budwood, so yung ikakabit nyo po, so as you can see po, should come from the known registered budwood garden of high productivity. So, somewhat related po kasi siya sa pagpili din ng planting materials. Siyempre, yung scion din dapat na pipiliin natin is disease tolerant and high yielding din po. So, para din po ito sa mga farmers natin na lalo na yung mga nagsisimula pa lang na kailangan nilang i-consider yung mga high yielding varieties in order para makabalik naman po kahit paano yung in-invest nila sa atin. Dun sa cacao, sorry. So, for the next slide po. So, yun po, medyo na-post lang po. Yan po. So, medyo nag-loading po. Okay po. So, next slide po. Ayan po. So, for the next slide po is part pa rin po siya ng farm maintenance. So, pruning can be carried out by using this tool. So, shears, scissors, and saw. And of course, chupon knife or a long handle pruner and chainsaw can also be used po. So, kung ano yung mas prefer nyo and mas alam nyo na mas makakadali dun sa pag-pruning nyo is syempre yun yung gamitin nyo. So maintenance of good sanitation practices on the farm is important. So diseases of infested pods, branches, and other plant material should be regularly removed from the tree. So yun nga po, so in order din sa maintenance ng good sanitation, kailangan natin yung mga insect infested na or yung disease infested na part ng plant or pods is kailangan tanggalin. Yun na yung para maiwasan na rin yung pagkalat ng sakit. So just to relate sa nangyayari sa ngayon, like COVID-19, kung may sakit ka, you need to isolate. So, yun lang naman yung parang madaling paliwanag kung bakit natin kailangan tanggalin agad or ihiwalay agad yung mga infected branches or pods para hindi na mahawa yung iba. Siyempre, para tuloy-tuloy lang. So, maging normal lang ulit yung flow ng ating sa farm. Hindi maka-apekto siya sa ating farm practices or farm management. So, for the next slide po. Okay po. So, for the soil management and fertilization po, so the soil should be evaluated for microbial and chemical hazard. So, you can do this po if, syempre, kung magpapa-analyze po tayo for microbial and chemical hazard, I think there is present laboratories in the regional field offices po that you can parang tanungin regarding po doon sa pagpapa-analyze ng soil, and of course, kahit ata yung water. And soil should not be contaminated with heavy metals. Farmers should use techniques to prevent soil erosion. Of course, kailangan din po yan. Actually, part din siya talaga ng farm management natin na para hindi siya maka-apekto or masira yung productivity ng ating cacao farm is, of course, we should ensure that they should not be contaminated with heavy metal. So, as you can see, heavy metal, lead, mercury, cadmium. So, different heavy metals that present in the soil should be analyzed po. And of course, for raw manure or human waste, must not be used for cultivation. So, kahit po sa organic standards, hindi pa po pwede yung human waste or human manure. So, agricultural workers who apply organic fertilizers should be trained on proper application. So, PPEs, guys. So, yun po. So, and of course, kailangan maging ano po tayo, matrain din natin yung mga personnel natin pagdating sa fertilizer application. Kasi baka mamaya, halimbawa, new hired ako, ang gawin ko lang, lagay ko lang sa lupa, so pabayaan ko na siya. Siyempre, mali yun. So, mamaya, pag-uusapan din natin po yung trainings na pwedeng i-conduct sa ating mga personnel sa farm. And of course, fertilizer should comply with the regulations of the Fertilizer and Pesticide Authority. So, at tayo naman po, kailangan din nating sumunod kung ano yung nasa batas. De syempre, kung ano lang po yung approved or registered sa FPA. Pwede pong siya lang po talaga yung dapat nating gamitin. Lalo na kung wag po tayong gagamit ng mga banned fertilizers or pesticides. Para din po sa inyo to, dahil para for long productivity din po ng inyong soil. Kaya po nila binan din to kasi may basis din sila kung bakit hindi pwede or mas nakakasama to dun sa lupa. So, for the next slide po. Ayan. So, for the pest management and crop protection po. So, major losses of cacao production in the world are due to pests and diseases. Controlling them is a key part efficient management of cacao farm. There are 4 methods used. So, as you can see po, feeling ko alam naman po ng iba sa inyo or majority ng iba sa inyo na ang major losses ng cacao is dahil sa pests and diseases. Siyempre, ito yung minsan hindi natin makontrol. Nandyan na kasi sa paligid, so nahihirapan na tayo pag nandyan na. So, there are 4 methods used in controlling them. There are 4. So, 1 is regulatory, cultural, biological, and chemical. So, regulatory measures are usually taken by law. Prevention of material contaminated from being transported into one area. So, plant quarantine. So, kaya po, di ba, parang naghihigpit tayo, lalo na pag may ibinabiyahe tayong ibang variety ng cacao, or kahit anong plants, hindi po natin pwede siyang dalhin agad sa isang lugar. Kasi baka mamaya maging peste siya or mamaya maka-apekto siya sa isang crop, lalong-lalo na kung halimbawa yung pinakang kinabubuhay ng mga tao doon is yung crop na yon is masama pala yung dinala mong crop. So, yung law natin, may mga law tayo or lalong-lalo na doon sa BPI na nag-implement nito doon sa plant quarantine services po nila na syempre, kailangan mo nang ma-quarantine yung ating mga halaman. So, relate ko rin po ulit sa mga nangyayari ngayon, of course, this pandemic. So, kailangan mag-quarantine. We're currently in the community quarantine. So, bakit ginagawa yung quarantine? Of course, para mapabagal yung pag-spread ng sakit. And of course, ganun din sa halaman para hindi na siya kumalat. Para hindi na kumalat or kung hindi man talaga mapigilan, syempre, konti lang yung maapektuhan. So, for the next one is the cultural. It is a broad approach. So, this includes the use of Trichoderma harzanium. So, yan lang po kasi yung nakita kong photo sa internet. So, this is incorporated in making compost po and biodegradable cacao leaves to control cacao pod borer. And the next one po is yung biological. So this include directly introducing other organisms that are natural enemies of plants and diseases such as black ants. So as you can see po, yung black ants. So paggamit ng mga natural enemies natin. So pinopromote po yan or ito talaga ina-emphasize din rather ng ating PNS for the Code of Practice for Cacao Beans. And the next one po is yung chemicals. So, chemicals that are toxic to pathogen are applied to cacao or shade trees, either to prevent pathogen inoculum from establishing in a host. So, for the chemical po, so, syempre, ito yung parang last resort. So, kung pwede. Kung pwede lang naman po, ito dapat yung last resort natin. Kung pwede siyang makontrol ng cultural and biological, syempre, yun po yung ini-implement natin. But, pag talaga lumalampas na siya sa economic threshold level natin, yung tinatawag, kung familiar tayo sa IPM, of course, doon lang mag-a-apply yung ating chemical control, which is doon na tayo nagsispray, naglalagay ng mga pesticides or insecticides. So, this codes emphasis the use of resistant varieties pa rin po. Cultural and biological farms should apply IPM or the Integrated Pest Management. So farmers should also be knowledgeable about the maximum residue levels, MRLs, enforced in destination markets. So sa mga hindi po knowledgeable or ngayon lang or new na narinig yung ating maximum residue level. So ito yung mga ini-impose ng isang country regarding pagdating dun sa mga parang residue nung active ingredient ng pesticide na makikita dun sa isang crop. So as you can see, yung MRLs po natin for cacao is not yet established po for the Philippines. So this it is being collection pa lang po yung status for the MRLs for cacao, but you can always refer po dun sa Codex MRLs and of course for kung meron po available sa ASEAN standard. And of course, dun sa dadalhan nyo na country, lalo na kapag nag-export po kayo ng cacao. So, next slide po. So, for personal health, hygiene, and sanitary facilities should be maintained by all personnel. Agricultural workers who come directly in contact with the cacao during and after harvesting should comply with hygiene and health requirements. So, sabi nga nila ngayon, lalo na ngayon, health is wealth. So, hygienic and sanitary facilities should be available to ensure that an appropriate degree of personal hygiene can be maintained. So, as you can see po, before pa lang yung standards natin is talaga nag-impose na ng strict hygienic measures po. Strict, pero nagagawa naman ng lahat. Dapat gawin ng lahat like washing hands. Of course, for the health status, any affected person should immediately report illness or symptoms of illnesses like hepatitis, tuberculosis, since they can contaminate the cacao. So, yun nga po, kaya din natin ginagawa yung parang pag-check ng health status nila is para maiwasan na rin yung contamination sa cacao. Lalo na po pag i-distribute natin for food purposes, 'di ba? Kahit sa naman pong kahit sa naman po siyang crops or kahit saan mo siya dalhin, lagi po nating ini-impose yung kailangan may hindi ma-contaminate yung produce mo. So, of course, kaya nga po minsan, di ba, required, ewan ko po, pero alam ko po sa lahat ng work required ang medical certificate bago ka pumasok sa trabaho. And of course, yun naman pong ating farm manager or kung sino po yung nag-manage ng farms, of course, kailangan din po silang regularly pinapacheck yung health ng ating personnel. So, lalo-lalo na po ngayon, it's important na nare-realize natin na health is kailangan talagang i-check. So, hindi siya dapat second option lang. So, for personal cleanliness, PPE should wash their hands. So PPE is, alam nyo na personal protective equipment. So hindi lang po sa hospital gumagamit ng PPEs. So lahat, kahit sa farm po, may mga PPEs tayo. So like yung gloves, boots, and long sleeves po. Basta po, mapoprotektahan yung ating personnel na pag nagtatrabaho po siya sa farm. And of course, for personal behavior. So spitting, smoking, chewing gum, sneezing, and coughing should be avoided. So dito pa lang po, 2011, bawal na umubo. So, pag nandun ka sa processing of cacao beans, bawal na. So, ngayon din po, so always wear your mask, lalo na pag nasa labas and stay at home po. So, of course, yun nga po. So, personal behavior is importante talaga. Not only sa food, of course, syempre para din dun sa tao na nakakasalamuha mo dun sa farm. Dito rin is ginagawa natin para ma-avoid yung contamination ng cacao bean. So, para na rin hindi mabalik sa atin once na may malaman silang na-contaminate po natin, na-contaminate yung ating cacao, syempre, lalo na pag pupunta tayo sa ipupunta natin sa ibang lugar yung ating cacao, of course, they are implementing din po strict rules regarding dun sa mga contaminants. So, we should be mindful regarding dun sa practices natin. So, for the next slide po. So, yun. So, equipment associated with growing and harvesting. So, farmers should follow technical specification on the use and maintenance of equipment. So, equipment and containers coming in contact with cacao should be non-toxic and food grade. So, dapat po yung mga materials na ginagamit natin for the equipments or sa paggawa ng equipments is food grade. We all know sa lahat po ng standards, just for the information of the body, lalo na po kapag food commodity yung pinag-uusapan, is lagi pong nire-recommend ng standards na food grade dapat yung ginagamit natin for the equipment. And of course, they should be constructed for easy cleaning and disinfection and maintained to avoid contamination. Syempre, kailangan regularly din natin silang nililinis and sinasanitize para maiwasan yung contamination. And containers no longer in hygienic conditions should be discarded. So, yung mga sira na container, syempre, kailangan na silang i-dispose. Kung hindi na naman natin magagamit, so, wag na natin ipagpilitan kasi baka mamaya, lalo lang sa pag pinagpipilitan natin, yung pala di natin namamalayan na contaminate na yung ating cacao beans. So, the equipment and tools should function according to the use for which they are designed and should not damage the cacao. Of course, lagi naman nating inaalala yung ating productivity. So, the equipment na gagamitin dapat natin is may ensure natin na hindi naman niya sana nado-damage yung cacao natin. So, for equipment of tools should function according to their use. So, yung mga equipment po natin, gamitin natin siya kung para saan lang siya. Kasi baka mamaya ginagamit natin siya kung ano-ano na ginagawa natin sa kanya, pero actually, pang dry lang siya, pang ganon, dryer lang siya. So, syempre, baka mamaya masira na din yung equipment natin. So, yung maintenance natin, masisira na din. And of course, maapektuhan na talaga yung farm processes and management natin. So, for the next slide po. So, for the handling and transport. Of course, ito po is very important. I know, alam ko lang pong alam ng mga iba sa inyo, especially if you are inclined sa cacao markets or cacao industry. Of course, prevention of cross-contamination. So, adverse weather conditions or other environmental factors. Rotten cacao should be segregated in the field. Harvesting containers should not be used for other purposes. When packing the cacao, care must be taken to avoid contamination. So, yun po yung parang kailangan natin mga isaalang-alang pagdating po sa cross-contamination. So, para ma-prevent natin, minsan yung adverse weather condition din po kasi and other environmental factors, syempre hindi natin minsan mapipigilan na maka-apekto sa ating harvest, lalo na kung nagto-transport tayo ng cacao. And for the transport of fresh or wet beans from the field to the on-farm fermentation and drying facility, the containers to be used in transport or hauling should be designed to minimize damage. So, alam naman natin na pag gumagamit tayo ng mga containers, syempre kaya nga natin siya ginagamit to minimize damage. Pero sana naka-design din siya para ma-minimize. Kung hindi maiwasan na magkaroon ng damage, minimize lang. And then made from non-toxic materials, again, and transport vehicles should not be used for hazardous substances unless they are clean and disinfected. So make sure po na lahat ng ginagamit natin sa farm, either for planting, harvesting, transporting, or either processing ng cacao is of course they always should be clean and disinfected. So for the next slide po. So for the cleaning and maintenance and sanitation po. So premises, fermentation and drying centers, and production and harvesting equipment should be kept and maintained in condition that will allow cleaning and disinfection. So as kung ikaw po ay isang farm personnel, of course, kailangan mini-maintain din natin yung mga gamit sa farm. Cleaning and disinfection program should be in place and carried out effectively and appropriately. Cleaning procedures should also include removal of debris from the equipment surfaces. Integrated pest management must be in place. Suitable provision for storage and removal of waste should be made. Of course, yung cleaning procedures should include removal of debris. Kasi baka mamaya ginamit mo sa isang lugar, tapos hindi mo alam may nakuha ka pala doon or naging vector na yung gamit mo na pala na pinanghuway mo sa ibang lugar, tapos dinala mo doon sa farm, hindi mo nilinis, tapos bigla mo na lang ulit ginamit doon sa cacao farm mo. So, nagdala ka na pala ng sakit doon na hindi mo na mamalayan, di ba? So, that should be the equipment and tools used in the farm should always be clean and sanitized. Para din po yun sa productivity and of course para din sa atin, yung sa kita natin, sa kikitain natin, hindi siya maka-apekto or makasira din sa ating farm management and practices. So for the next slide po. So, yun na po. So, doon natapos yung primary production natin. As you can see po, medyo general yung provision na nakita nyo kanina for the primary production. Kung nakabasa na po kayo ng different COP for different commodities and good agricultural practices, halos same lang po yung mga provisions. But for these standards po, of course, in-emphasize natin yung pagdating sa cacao beans o doon sa cacao farms, pagdating sa primary production po. So, dito po sa control of operation, ito na yung focus niya talaga is sa cacao. So, as you can see po, so control of food hazards, key aspects of hygiene and control system, incoming material requirements, packaging, management and supervision, documentation and records, and recall procedures. For these standards po, in-emphasize dito yung key aspects, yung naka-yellow highlight po, of hygiene and control system, documentation and records, and recall procedures. For the gray highlights po, we can always refer po to general principles of food hygiene. So, it's a general provision po pagdating sa standards. So, for the next slide po. So, for the key aspects of hygiene and control system, so under niya po yung pod harvesting. So, as you can see po, according to these standards, from pollination, cacao pods form, mature, and ripen between 160 to 180 days. I'm not sure kung ito applicable sa lahat ng area, but for this standard po, naka-range naman po siya. So, 160 to 180 days. Kung sumobra ka sa 160 and kung bumaba ka sa 180, pasok pa rin naman siya dun sa range. And of course, change in color. Ito na po ata yung maturity indices. When green pods turn to yellow, dark red or purple pods turn to yellow or orange, and yellow lines on the skin appear. So, masasabi nyo na daw po na ripe na yung cacao, kung yan na po, kung nag-change na siya in color to yellow or dark, red or purple, pods turn to yellow or orange, and yellow lines on the skin appear, as you can see po dun sa pictures na naka-flash. And of course, harvest healthy ripe pods at approximately 75% ripeness. This is advisable po to avoid loss of the mucilage which is the source of sugar needed during the fermentation process. So, yung pong pag-harvest natin ng 75% ripeness is related po doon sa fermentation process na gagawin natin doon sa cacao beans. So unripe pods should not be harvested. These contribute to defects such as slaty beans. So wag daw po tayo mag-harvest ng ng unripe pods o nung hilaw pa. So, pwede daw po kasi ito mag-result dun sa ating slaty beans. Yung mga different defects and damages for cacao beans or cocoa beans will be presented to you later for the PNS 58, which is the cacao or cocoa beans specification and grading. Dun mas detailed yung ipapakita or ita-discuss pagdating dun sa mga grading and sorting ng ating beans. So, harvesting should be done every week during peak season, sabi, sa standard, and 2 weeks for the non-peak season, and can be stored for 7 days in shaded area. So, sabi nga po dito sa standard natin, good harvest and post-harvest practices should be applied to good, consistent quality in food safety. So, up to our harvesting, di ba? Lagi na po natin ina-emphasize yung good handling. So, and of course, yung ating post-harvest practices should be applied also good for post-harvest practices to ensure good, consistent quality and food safety. So, a machete or bolo or pruning shear or cacao hook on a stick is commonly used to remove the pods from the tree. Depende po kung ano yung practice ninyo sa inyong farm. So, for the next slide po, so, yan po. So, pod breaking and removal of seeds. So, for pod breaking may be done in cacao farm immediately after harvesting within 7 days after harvest. So, the pod knife should be at most 1 centimeter to avoid damaging the bean. So, syempre, pag na-harvest na, kailangan naman po natin ingatan yung ating mga cacao beans. So, removal of seed or wet beans attached to the placenta may be done manually or using by hand or tool scooper. So, just to make sure lang po, to avoid contamination, of course, you need to wash your hands po. And of course, the scooper or the tool you will be using is clean and sanitized. So, for the baton or pod splitter, so as you can see po dun sa picture, yung nakikita natin na parang kutsilyo na steady lang. No, pero may kutsilyo din po, I think, na should be designed into consideration hygienic cleaning. So, kailangan daw po na parang nakadesign din siya sa madali lang linisin. Of course, madali siyang i-disinfect. So, damaged beans should be discarded. So, yung mga medyo na damaged na beans natin, need na siyang i-disregard or itapo na. So, wag na natin panghinayangan kasi baka lalo tayong manghinayang kapag sinama pa natin siya doon, damage na nga siya, di ba? So, scoop bean should be placed in suitable container. So, ilagay natin siya sa suitable container na which malinis din, of course, is disinfected and sanitized. And the collectors of the bean should be put label in each batch of beans collected from specific farmer for traceability purposes. So, kung kayo po ay nangongolekta ng beans sa different farm sites, of course, records and documentation is really important po. So, pag medyo napansin nyo parang may mali sa beans nyo or dun sa beans na to, makita nyo agad o matrace nyo agad kung saan ang galing. So, pwede nyo ma-confirm sa kanya or dun sa farm na yun kung bakit ganito yung nangyari sa beans. So, para hindi ka na malilito kung bakit nagkaganito yung production or yung product mo. So, for the next slide po, so for the key aspects, under pa rin po ng key aspects of hygiene and control system is of course the fermentation of the cacao beans. So fermentation of cacao beans, according to these standards, normally takes 5 days. So germinated beans from overripe and infested pods should be separated and discarded as well as the moldy cacao beans. Cacao beans should be fermented in fermented boxes. So as you can see po, nakikita niyo yung mga fermented boxes po, but meron din po mga fermentation baskets. May box, syempre pag yun yung medyo malakihan na, and of course dun sa baskets po. So design of fermentation should consider drainage po of fermentation. So dahil nga nagpe-ferment tayo, asahan natin na may mga drippings or yung parang mga tumutulo. So, for ease of turning and air circulation, so, kailangan may drainage siya. So, fermented boxes should be covered including jute sacks or banana leaves. So, kung wala kayong available na jute sacks, banana leaves will do. Pero, syempre, ensure natin na malinis din yung i-cover natin na banana leaves. So, boxes should have removable divider. So, yung pwede daw po siyang siguro naaalis. And for this standard po, 75 centimeter by 75 centimeter by 45 centimeter deep, or 1 meter by 1 meter by 0.5 meter can accommodate 200 to 400 kilogram wet beans. And for the 1 meter by 1 meter by 0.5 meter, of course, 400 to 450 kilogram wet beans po, kaya din niya. And for a central fermentation po, which is 150 centimeter by 50 centimeter, kaya, I think, 1,100 kilogram yung kaya niya. So, yun po. So, next slide po. So, fermentation of cacao beans. So, sasabihin ko lang po ulit na baka mamaya may nagtatanong sa inyo na nasan naman yung para sa unfermented beans. So, this standard po is only covering po as of the moment sa ang fermented beans. So, hindi pa po siya na-revise. So, we will review din po itong standard na ito. So, for the fermentation of cacao beans are turned 48 hours or 2 days after loading in fermentation boxes or baskets. So, the temperature during this period must reach 38 to 39 degrees Celsius. So, as you can see, nakikita nyo yung nasa picture, nagte-turn siya ng cacao beans. But I think nakuha ko siya, ano ata siya sa ibang bansa pa. So, yun. So, for the next cacao beans, should remain in boxes or baskets for the next 3 days, and the temperature must reach 45 to 50 degrees Celsius. So, dapat daw, after 3 days, na-reach na yung 45 to 50 degrees Celsius. So, turning of beans in fermentation boxes should be done with paddle or shovel. So, as you can see, ginagamit ni Kuya sa picture is I think, parang paddle na parang, or shovel rather. So, while beans in basket with hands properly washed. Siyempre, kung gagamitin nyo naman in parang sa small production lang naman and basket, yung gagamitin nyo, hands will do naman po. But make sure na sanitize and clean yung hands ninyo. And of course, factors that influence fermentation includes ripeness of the pods, quantity of beans, type of cacao, duration of fermentation. So baka iniisip natin, yung turning lang yung may kinalaman doon sa fermentation. It's not po. So yung ripeness o yung gaano ka-ripe, kahinog, yung cacao, yung pods natin, yung hinarvest natin, syempre may factors. And of course, kung gaano karami yung beans, and yung type of cacao natin or variety, and of course, yung kung gaano kahaba natin siya finerman. So, the process of turning ensures uniform heating of the beans. So, pag sinabi kasing fermentation, di ba, may involves po dyan na heating. So, it allows air to circulate, break lumps, and prevents formation of lump beans and prevents formation of molds in beans. Without turning process, the beans will be improperly fermented, moldy, and will produce off odor. So, pag pina-ferment daw natin siya and hindi natin siya tina-turn, hindi siya ma-ferment ng maayos. So, magre-result siya dun sa moldy beans and of course, magpo-produce siya ng off odors. So, as you can see po, mamaya makikita nyo yung moldy beans. Mamaya, lalo na doon sa specification and grading. So, the temperature lower than 45 will resort into adequately fermented cacao beans. So, for the next slide po. So, yan po. So, as you can see po, yung pictures po natin is available din po sa existing PNS natin for the COP of cacao beans. So, for the quality indicators of fermentation progress, this is the illustrative example po. So, as you can see po, for the under-fermented beans, ang color niya po is, ako kasi sa tingin ko parang purplish siya, but sa standard, they said that it is pinkish white. Nibs remain purple with very pale brown pigments. Yung nibs niya naman po is remain purple daw po or parang violet. And yung smell niya is matamis. And yung number of days, siguro nito kaya under-fermented siya is less than 5 days. Kasi 5 days po yung recommended na fermentation na days dito sa ating standard. So, for the adequately fermented beans, so kung nakakakita na kayo ng mga beans na ganyan, I think you're familiar na. So, for the adequately fermented beans, as you can see, reddish brown na po. So, kulay chocolate na talaga siya. So, the nibs is pale brown in the center and more pale reddish purple around with a ring dark brown under the external skin. So medyo marami siyang color. So the smell, of course, dahil na-ferment, maasim. So walang na-ferment na matamis or mabango. I mean, like suka, kahit ano atang fina-ferment. Like kimchi, di ba? Pag yung mga fina-ferment na foods is talagang maasim siya. So, and of course, yung number of days niya in fermentation kapag adequately fermented, of course, 5 days. So, for the over-fermented beans, so yan parang medyo, ano na po siya, dark. So, parang, kung ba parang overcooked sa ating term. And, of course, for the over-fermented beans, black, brown, sticky. So, nib, deep, dark brown, or black brown. So, number of days po nito, probably, na-ferment siya ng more than 6 days. So, as you can see po, yung color ng pagkakaiba nilang tatlo, for the illustrative example po. So, yan. Pag under-fermented, parang medyo purplish. Pag adequately fermented, brown in color, parang chocolate in color na talaga siya. And for the over-fermented po, yung dark brown na parang medyo sunog yung pagkakatingin ko sa kanya. So, proper cacao bean fermentation brings out the best chocolate flavor. So, yun yung sabi. Dito sa standard po natin na yung pag daw tama yung pag-ferment mo, ito yung nagbe-bring out ng chocolate flavor. So, too short fermentation produces violet or purple bean with weak flavor. Too long fermentation results to rotten beans which have putrid taste or lasang bulok na siya and produces of flavors. So, as you can see, hindi kailangan na kulang, hindi rin pwede yung nasobrahan, kailangan yung takma lang. So, dito, sakto lang. So, for the next slide po. Ayan. So, for under pa rin po ng key aspects of hygiene and control system, of course, the drying of cacao beans. So, fermentation and drying, lagi po siyang magkaakibat pag sa fermented cacao beans. So, for the combined, dito po kasi sa ating country, alam naman natin na it is a tropical country, but marami rin po yung panahon na tag-ulan. So, dry and wet season po tayo dito sa atin. So, combined sun and mechanical drying is used in the Philippines with sun drying 1 to 2 days po. About 31 hours at full day sunshine at 46 hours, 4 to 6 hours sunshine per day and finishing up with artificial drying. As you can see po, syempre, hindi 24 hours. Baka nagtataka yung iba, bakit hindi 24 hours? Syempre, yung gabi, hindi na po kasala yung syempre, pag mga 5 or wala na atang masyadong sikat ng araw. So, yun, mga 4 to 6 hours lang po yung nakukonsume na full day sunshine. And umaabot siya ng 1 to 2 days po. And pinifinish yung ating drying sa ating mechanical dryer na. So, beans shall be turned several times each day to ensure uniformly dried beans. So, hindi lang po sa fermentation yung pagtaturn ng beans. Para din po maging uniform yung drying ng ating beans, it should be turned several times each day to ensure uniformly dried beans. And of course, sun drying should be done in elevated solar dryers to avoid contamination. Kailangan na po yung hindi pwede yung nakikita natin yung sa palay na parang nandyan lang sa gilid ng kalsada. So, hindi daw po recommended yun as per the PNS. So, kailangan elevated siya kasi kapag nakalapag lang siya dyan sa semento or dun sa tabi ng daan, prone talaga siya sa contamination. Not only chemical but also physical contamination kasi baka mamaya may sumama na bato-bato or kahit anumang physical contaminants like plastics or whatever it is na pwedeng sumama doon. So, the dryer should be covered with a clear UV plastic, at least 200 millimicrons or with a screen. So, the temperature for artificial dryer should not exceed 60 degrees Celsius. So, hindi po yung hindi kailangan masyadong mataas. Kung hindi natin kailangan pabilisin yung pagdry. Kaya kailangan parang 60 degrees Celsius lang po for the gradual removal of water. Because rapid drying causes sour taste. Insufficient drying results in moldy beans. So for the first day po of drying is the full term of fermentation. So yun daw pong unang araw na nag-dry tayo is yun na daw po yung tinatawag sa full term fermentation of the cacao beans. So the cacao beans will only develop the right brown color inside if they are properly fermented and dried. So yung kanina na pinakita ko doon na adequately fermented, ma-attain lang daw natin yun, yung right brown color if adequately not only fermented but kailangan na-dry din siya ng ayos. So during the whole drying process, the moisture is reduced from 45 to 7. So bumababa siya up to 7%, which is ideal according to the PNS. Artificial dryer with dimensions of 6 meters by 12 meters can accommodate 5,000 kilogram. And rapid drying causes beans sour taste because it retains excessive amounts of acetic acids. So acetic acid, kung familiar kayo sa suka, it is present doon, which results to sour taste. Kaya siya nagiging maasim. So for the next slide po, sorry. So for the sorting and grading, so this for provision po, hindi ko masyado na siyang i-discuss since it will be discussed in the next topic. So for the cacao beans are stored to remove the sort po yun, to remove the flat, slaty, black, moldy, small, double beans, and beans with insect damage. So mamaya po, makikita nyo din siguro dun sa presentation po ni Sir Val, yung itsura ng mga sinasabi ko, ano yung flat? Baka sinasabi, ano yung flat? Ano yung slaty? Ano yung moldy? What do you mean by that? Pero mamaya po, mas makikita nyo siya dun sa presentation nun sa PNS BAFS 58, which is the sorting and grading. So, the grading and specification of the cacao beans are specified, which I already told you po na PNS BAFS 58. So, for during sorting and grading, personnel shall wear protective clothing and footwear. So, hindi lang po na-harvest na natin siya. Tigil na tayo sa pag-maintain ng ating sanitation and cleanliness. Of course, PPEs pa rin po should be observed when you are doing sorting and grading. Manual sorting to remove defective beans should be done with hands properly washed. So, always wash your hands po. And using hand gloves to prevent direct contact of the dried cacao beans. So, this is done din po, of course, to prevent contaminations of the beans. So, for the next slide po, yan. So, dito na po tayo sa packaging and storage. So, medyo nakikita nyo na ba kung saan, sunod-sunod lang kasi siya So, yung process. So, for the packaging and storage, dried cacao should be packed and sealed in bags made of food-grade or non-toxic materials such as jute bags or sacks. So, the bag should have labeled, imprinted on the sack or bag indicating the production batch number and date, cooperative, farmer, area, and the grade of beans. So, hindi pwede na porket may nakita kayong sako dyan, pwede na yon. Siyempre, kailangan yung food grade po. Kailangan na malinis din siya dahil nga, para saan pa kung in-avoid nyo na makontaminate yung beans nyo from planting hanggang sorting, tapos pag-packaging, tapos gagamit lang kayo ng parang contaminated packaging, para mababaliwala lang yung pag-iingat natin. So, this should be also considered. So, of course, the label is very, very important din po. Para na rin po ito dun sa consumer information and of course, para din po dun sa ating mga consumer and of course, para na rin po sa inyo for the traceability. So, the bag cacao bean should be placed in storage sheds that are weatherproof, well-ventilated, free from moisture and insect pests and away from smoke and other odors. So, yun po. So, ensure din natin na naka-place siya sa maayos and well-ventilated na lugar. Kasi baka mamaya, parang magkaroon ng contamination if ever may nalagay or biglang nabasa yung beans nyo. So, i-avoid natin yun. So, cacao beans should be stored above the ground at least 7 cm using pallets and away from walls. So, bags should stack in such way that individual grades and lots separated by a passage at least 60 cm wide. So, hindi pwede na bara-bara lang tayo magpatas na or mag-stock ng cacao bean bags. So, kailangan, inaano rin to, para sa standard, parang in such a way that individual grades, parang meron tayong nandito siya, delineation, kung dito siya, or division rather, dito yung grade 1A, 2A, or 2C, 2B, ganun po, para hindi din nakakalite. And of course, para rin po talaga sa atin din naman na for easy management din po. So, disinfestation of approved fumigant may be carried out as indicated in PNS 58. So, for the fumigants use po, of course, we only allow din po sa PNS is yung mga registered fumigants po. So, as you can see po, meron tayong uh, fumigants registered. Of course, available po siya, I think, sa or dun talaga siya available sa Fertilizer and Pesticide Authority. So, next slide po. So, yan. Nandito na po tayo sa documentation and records. So, documentation and records. Records should be kept. So, the period should be longer than the shelf life of dried cacao beans. So, yung records nyo, kailangan daw is longer, na ikikip nyo longer sa shelf life ng cacao beans. So, bakit? Kasi, syempre, hanggat hindi nagagamit or hindi nyo na-out yung cacao beans nyo, may possibility or may chance na kailangan nyo siyang i-trace or i-check yung record for consumer purposes or sa safety. So, for recall procedures, traceability system should be applied to ensure effective lot identification. So, the traceability system should be applied para din po ma-ensure na yung lot identify natin is tama. So, 75 so, documentation and records and traceability is laging magkasama. So, yung recall procedures, yun yung sinasabi natin na traceability. So, for the information of the body po, meron din po tayo na Philippine National Standard for Traceability of Cacao. So, you can check it in our website po. Libre lang naman po yun. So, for the next slide po. So, for transportation po, so hindi natatapos. After po kasi nung ating documentation and records and recall procedure, syempre yung kasunod na niya is yung transportation. So, ito yung pagta-transport na nung cacao beans natin. So, cacao beans should be prevented from getting wet during loading and transportation. Syempre, sa pagta-transport, kailangan handle with care din tayo. Ayaw din naman natin na masayang yung effort na ginawa natin simula ng pagtatanim sa pag-iingat dun sa mga cacao hanggang maging cacao bean siya, hanggang ito-transport na siya, na masasayang lang kapag ikakarga na tapos biglang nabasa. So, syempre, di ba, losses na rin yun para sa atin. So, cacao beans should be stored in one location of the cargo vessel. So, I think this is tackling about na po sa mga container vans and pagkakarga na sa cargo vessels. So, fire risk materials, hazardous or poisonous materials shall not be stored with cacao beans. So, kahit sa naman po sigurong food commodities is iniiwasan po natin na magtabi or lagyan ng kasama na para mga hazardous chemicals po. So, cacao shipping should be clean and free from residue of previous cargo. So, yun po, kailangan din natin i-ensure na yung pagdadalahan natin na cacao beans is malinis din po and safe, of course. And of course, product information for consumer awareness, marking and labeling is very, very important po. So this is one of the minimum requirements po for every product standards. So mamaya po, for the product standards discussion, makikita natin kung ano ba yung mga minimum requirements pagdating sa labeling. Ano ba yung mga need natin, like ito ba mandatory, ito ba optional. So need po kasi nating malaman yun. Not only for the farmer, but of course for the consumer. Kailangan natin kasi ingatan din po or bigyan ng assurance or information yung mga gagamit ng product natin. So, for the next slide po, yan. So, for trainings po. So, syempre, for farm establishment or kahit continuous yung farm practices or management nyo, trainings should be conducted. So farmers, agricultural workers, and other personnel involved in the primary production should be aware on the essential quality parameters. So para po malaman nila ito, so kailangan aware sila or matrain po sila as much as possible pagdating sa GAP, good agricultural practices, good hygienic practices, and good manufacturing practices. So ito pong tatlo is like magkakaugnay, I think. Kaya ito yung nire-recommend ng PNS for training. So personnel should have the knowledge and skills to carry out respective tasks. So in order din po sa lahat naman siguro ng company, farms, or manufacturer is kailangan nilang i-train yung kanilang personnel para ma-carry out nila na maayos yung trabaho nila. Syempre, lalo na kung bago ka, syempre, kailangan mo ng background kung ano ba yung gagawin ko, di ba? So, personnel associated with fermentation and drying operation should be aware of GMP and GHP. Syempre, ito yung processing na part na po kasi, so kailangan aware yung ating mga personnel pagdating doon. So, personnel who handle cleaning chemicals or any hazardous chemicals should be trained safe in handling technique. Yun po, so yung mga pesticide natin or fumigants, kailangan may training din yung mga personnel natin. I think FBA po is conducting din po trainings pagdating po na sa mga application natin or kahit sa mga LGUs natin or regional field offices ng Department of Agriculture is conducting po different trainings regarding that matter. And of course, training program po, as you can see, GAP, GHP, and GMP. So, I think, next slide po. Yan. For copies of Philippine National Standards po, you may visit our website, www.bafs.da.gov.ph po. So, libre lang po yun. So, just go to our website po to access po. And I think that's the end of my presentation po. So, thank you po.
Thank you, Krish, for pointing out the important provisions for the Code of Practice Standard for cacao bean. So, hopefully, na-capture po natin lahat ng na-share ni Ms. Krisha. And let's now proceed to our Q&A portion. First question from Agri Escuela. What are BAFS approaches that help ordinary cacao farmers attain the meticulous provision of the PNS? Ayan po. Hello. Actually, sir or ma'am, maliban po sa ginaganap nating mga seminar awareness, you can also contact po our DARFOs. So, kung saan region po siguro kayo, you can ask them assistance from the regional GAP team po natin.
Yun po. So, yun po, to answer din po sa tanong ni Mr. or Miss Escuela. So, yun po, I think this is part din po, one of our approach din po to help ordinary cacao farmers. So, information dissemination po, na syempre, ang standards po lagi is nakaset po siya sa minimum requirements in order to help po yung ating mga small processors. Hindi po siya enough para dun sa ating big manufacturing or farmers or processors. Lagi po natin kinoconsider din yung ating small farmers. So, as you can see po, this activity po is one of our approach din po to help the farmers. And of course, the public consultation meetings din po na conducted of our division po, the Standards Development Division, is consulting different organizations, associations when we are drafting or revising the draft standard po para po malaman namin kung ano yung hinaing ba or kung ano yung parang ano po ba yung concern ng mga farmers natin para ma-voice out po namin siya dun sa mga experts namin and ma-consider siya sa PNS. So yun po, yung being transparent po is one of our approach, of course, and of course, yung information dissemination po. So, thank you po.
Thank you, Krish. So, meron din po nagtanong. So, for export market, what are some pesticides that are recommended for cacao with acceptable MRLs?
Okay. So, kanina po kasi sa I already explained na rin po. Pagdating po kasi sa MRLs po, the PNS for maximum residue limits for cacao is just being gathering data po. Parang nasa field data gathering stage pa po. So, as you can see po, wala pa po kasi tayong established I think na MRLs for cacaos. Nagsa-start pa lang po tayo. But you can always ask po the Fertilizer and Pesticide Authority. And of course, depende rin po kasi kung saan nyo dadalhin yung cacao beans nyo. Like if it is abroad, of course, if they have the MRLs and if they are following codex po, yun po yung susundin natin. And yung pong sa website ng Codex, I think nandun na po lahat. Pag commodity specific po kasi sila. So you can see access po their website. I'm not familiar lang po kasi dun sa mga different active ingredients or AI po. But yun po, you can check po in other, syempre yung ASEAN po. I think meron din ng MRL sa ASEAN. I'm not sure po kung meron na rin po sila for cacao or cocoa beans.
Yes. So, nandito rin po kasama natin si Sir Sam. So, para din po manlinawan tayo dun sa tinatanong ni Agri Escuela. So, may sagot po si Sir Sam.
Hello, good afternoon.
Hello po. Good afternoon po.
Narinig po ako. As mentioned po ng BAFS, kasi dinidevelop pa nga natin dito sa Philippines ang cacao. Itong data na nasa akin, I got it from the Codex. As of, ang latest dito is 2019. Merong dalawa or 2468 MRL. So, ito yung mga pesticide na nandito, clothianidin, endosulfan, hydrogen phosphide, ito yung fumigate siguro, and then mandipropamide, metalaxyl, methylbromide, pyroclostrobin, thiamethoxam. So may mga kanya-kanyang level po ito. So ang pinakamataas na may ano dito is yung 0.2 na metalaxyl. 5 itong 5 ppm pa lang, methylbromide. Usually ito po yung pang-unit. So, kung lang po yung crop and then papasok sa cacao, makikita niyo po lahat yung mga bawat ng pesticides po dito. Okay? Thank you.
To add lang po pala dun sa MRLs po, kasi we are working din po regarding dun sa MRLs po. Meron daw po naka-registered sa FEA po, but for the PNS po is kinokollect, yun nga po, kinokollect pa lang yung data. So on process pa lang po yung crafting ng PNS MRLs for cacao po. So yun lang po. Thank you po.
Sige po. Proceed po tayo with the next question from Sir Jimmy Maniago. So, where can we access the video to share with other interested farmers? Okay. Siguro po ang tinutukoy ni Sir ay yung video natin kanina. Smart, tama kaya doon? Or other video material siguro na available. Actually, we will give yung materials po natin pagka fill out na po ng ating evaluation sheet after po nitong ating session. So, we have 3 topics. So, right after po nung ikatlo nating topic, we'll be sending you the link for the evaluation form. And then after po nan, makaka-receive kayo ng email po. Saan po ma-access yung ating materials.
Yes, so yung session naman po natin today ay pwede nyo pong ma-access anytime dito po sa aming BAFS FB page. Pwede nyo din po siyang ma-share sa inyong mga kapwa farmers. So yun. So next question po. So in the absence of fermentation box, what are other simplified methods for fermentation?
So, yun po, kanina, I think nabanggit ko din po. So, kung wala po kayong fermentation boxes, fermentation baskets will do po. So, yun kasi yung parang nire-recommend din. Though nabanggit din siya sa standards natin na kasi yung fermentation boxes minsan sa malalaking production lang or kung wala talaga available, baskets will do po. Yun, parang mas-simplified lang yung fermentation. Yung parang mga knitted baskets po yun. So, dapat din syempre yung makakalabas yung liquid po. Kasi syempre yung boxes natin may drainage. And then, ensure lang din natin yung sa baskets po, merong madidrip or madadaanan yung liquid natin. So, yun lang po.
So, ayan po, naka-flash po sa screen natin yung ating website for the BAFS. The next question po is, ano po ang standard na style ng facility para sa post-harvest facilities ng cacao production?
So, ano pa? Okay, standard style ng facility po. So, for the facility and design po kasi for the cacao production po, naka-refer po kasi siya dun sa ating Codex standard for hygienic practices. You can also check Codex po. Kasi actually, hindi lang po ako ganun ka-sure kung meron na tayong PNS or Philippine version noon. Pero you can always access the website po of Codex since yun po kasi yung naka-refer. Yung po kasi natin provision for the design and facilities is general provision po siya. So, Codex standard po siya naka-refer. So, for the information lang din po.
So, thank you, Krish. So, may nagtanong po, paano kami maka-avail ng post-harvest facility?
Oh. Paano ba? Siguro, sir, you can coordinate with the DA regional offices po. I think may mga cacao program po siguro doon. They can help you po, assisting po. Pero sa amin po kasi standards lang po. So, yun po.
Next question po from Sir Boyet Bahandi. May value po kayo ng production ng Philippine cacao? Ilan po ang percent natin sa world production?
Oh, actually po, hindi ko pa siya na-check kung ilan kung ano yung status ng production natin ng Philippine cacao. But mamaya po, I think you can ask Sir Val. Hi, Sir Val. Ano po dun sa production ng Philippine cacao? Kasi hindi po ako ganun updated pagdating po dun sa production. But I think, i-check ko din po. We'll go into check lang din po. Thank you po.
Meron po tayong hanggang 5 p.m. So, balikan po namin kayo mamaya ni Krish. Or pwede nyo din natin po palang itanong dun sa ating next speaker. So, yan. Thank you, Krish.
Yes po.
Okay.
So,
Pwede ko
nandito po
sagutin
ulit ang aming director, si Director Mamaril.
yung design ng facility kanina, if I may add lang, there is no prescribed design of the facility. Kung pag-uusapan natin is cacao processing, siya pa may balak, ano bang product niya? Tablihiya ba? Or only the cacao seeds na gagawing tablihiya? Kasi pa pwedeng ang ipoproduce mo lang ay yung seeds and then somebody will get the seeds from you para gawing tablihiya or gusto mo talaga gumawa ng tablihiya. Yun ang gusto nating liwanagin sa design ng facility, ano? Ito ba yung tatawag na post-harvest facility ba to for processing? Kasi kung yun ang kailangan niya, walang prescribed design, kung pwede lang dito, usually ay ang Food and Drug Administration, meron tayong participant from FDA. Sila kasi nag-i-issue ng good manufacturing practice. So it's a matter of complying with our own GMP or good manufacturing practice. Yung kanina naman na nagtatanong na gusto niya ba mag-avail ng post-harvest facility? Ano ba yung kanina? Ano yung gusto niyang i-avail? Ayun, yung post-harvest facility, walang ibinibigay na post-harvest facility, pero kung sa high-value program, Mecija is in Iloilo, tama ba? Taga Iloilo itong Mecija, ano? I may be poor in my geography, pero I think Mecija is in Iloilo. Pwede mo makausap yung mama. Yung taga Mecija farmers. Taga Iloilo po ba kayo?
Thank you, sir. Kay Mecija Farmers MFAC. So baka po pwede namin po kayong ma-invite po dito sa loob ng studio natin para po ma-meet po kayo ni sir and matanong niyo po personally yung tanong niyo kanina. So, Ilalagay lang po namin yung link nung studio namin and sana po maka-attend po kayo or makapasok po kayo dito sa studio.
O sige, kung ang design nila ay mga equipment for processing, ang hindi ko alam kung merong maibibigay sa inyo ang ang DA Regional Field Office number 6 sa Iloilo to. Merong DA Regional Office po dyan. Pwede nyo pong kausapin ang focal person ng high value crops. Baka ho, pwede kayo doon humingi ng assistance, whatever. Kasi talagang gusto binibigyan ng assistance ito, mga group of farmers, hindi individual hanggat maaari. Lalo't magbibigay ng mga makinarya o ng equipment. Ang priority yung binibigyan ay ang mga farmers group kesa individual. So sa Mecija farmers po ng Iloilo, ang recommendation ko po ay pumunta kayo sa DA Regional Field Office ng Iloilo. Department of Agriculture po yan na Regional Field Office sa Iloilo. Hindi ko lang alam kung anong eksaktong lugar yung opisina nila doon, pero nakarating na ako doon. Pasensya na kayo, nalimutan ko. Tanungin niyo po kung sino ang lead person nila ng high value crops, lalo na po sa cacao. At palagay ko po ay meron siyang maitutulong sa inyo. Salamat po. Yung datos naman ng cacao production ng Pilipinas, hindi tayo net exporter ng cacao o ng tsokolate, no? Pero nakakapag-export tayo ng processed product na. Ang alam ko, meron tayong mga tsokolating na i-export na. And they say na, sinasabi nga ng Undersecretary Yusek Lavinia ng High Value Crops na sa France, parang yung Pilipinas tsokolate ay na-award as being one of the best tasting chocolates, no? Pero ito yung process sa tsokolate na to. Hindi ko lang alam kung it was in tablilla form, pero that was in France around 2 or 3 years ago. So hindi pa tayo net exporter, pero alam natin na merong malaking demand ang cacao. Ito yung tinatawag nilang ang katawag nga ito kung merong Nescafe Gold, ang tawag na nila rito is the cacao gold. The high value crops take views that the cacao is a gold mine, kaya po ine-encourage na yung tao ay mag-go into cacao production, pero siyempre po, kailangan nyo ng merkado, kaya nga po ang aking suggestion ay lalo na yung taga Mecija, no? Na nandyan lang po ang DA Region 6 within your province. Kung po pwede kayong magbiyahe, so ano lang tayo, keep safe when we travel now. So salamat po.
Ayan. Thank you po, Director Mamaril. So may nag-comment po, value adding cacao into chocolates, way to go. Thanks, sir. Wala po kay Boyet Bahandi. So meron pa po bang mga questions? Pahabol na questions po kay Miss Krish.
Ito po, we have a question again from Agri-Eskwela. Paano po mapaparami ang population ng pollinators ng cacao sa cacao field?
So, sa pollinators po, I think the standard, kasi actually sa standard, hindi po siya nakalagay. But I think yung sa pagdating naman po sa pollinators, yung mga different practices po, like sa pagpaparami is being trained by po, I think ATI, they do have some trainings po pagdating po doon. And of course po, we'll do check din po if sa standard po will be mag-a-appear siya since this is a minimum requirements lang po. So, yun lang po.
May I say something?
Sir? Sir.
Number one, I don't think that our standards will have any mention about pollinators. Okay. Paano mo paparaming population ng populators ng cacao sa cacao field? Number one, iwasang gumamit ng ng insecticides in general. Kasi po, ang pollinators po natin karaniwan ay mga insekto. Kaya kung parehang gamit nyo ng insecticide, ang pollinators po ay bababa ang populasyon. Next, ang isa sa mga sikat o popular na pollinators po sa mga halaman ay ang honeybee. So, kung merong honeybee malapit doon sa inyo na nag-aalaga o baka gusto niyo mag-release ng konting honeybees doon, honeybees are good pollinators po. So, yun lang ho. Iwas ang gamit ng insecticide kasi papatayin niya ang mga insekto. Friendly and enemy. The friends and the enemies. Kaya po, yun ang number one na strategy gagawin po ninyo.
Hello, can I
Thank
join
you.
the discussion?
Pero yung mga nagtatanim ng kakao, mas alam nila yan. Yung akin lang naman, general principle, huwag kang gagamit masyado ng insecticide. At proper timing po. Aanin mo yung pollinators mo kung wala namang bulaklak. Di ba? You need pollinators at the onset of flowering kasi po sila yung magiging agent natin. So, at flowering time, iwasan po na maggamit ng insecticide. Salamat po.
Pwedeng mag-join lang.
Yes, sir. Yes po, Sir Val.
Yes po,
Yes,
Sir Val. Medyo mahina lang po yung ano po. Yung
Yes,
sound.
about sa tanong sa
Yeah.
okay na, klaro na?
Yes po, sir.
Yes, sir.
About sa tanong sa kung paano paparamihin ang population ng pollinators. Ganito ho 'yon, huwag niyong tanggalin yung basura ninyo sa loob ng farm ninyo. Basura meaning yung decomposed materials from mga na-prone na mga branches at saka dahon. Kasi kung saan yun mag-decompose, doon ho sila nagbe-breeding. So hindi sila nagbe-breeding pag dry kasi ang area. So ang tendency ng pollinators is maghahanap sila nung area habitat nila, which is ang maganda kasi kung may saging sana kasi gusto nila yung medyo basa. So pag basa-basa sila, mas fertile animals dyan, mga kambing, ganon. Mas maging fertile sila pag merong masipsip na dugo. Kaya minsan pag magpunta tayo sa loob ng kakawan natin, may kumakagat sa mga sa kamay, sa katawan natin kasi nagsisipsip sila ng dugo. Then the moment magsipsip sila ng dugo, mas maging fertile sila, so mas dadami sila. And by the way, yung pollinators pala natin, midges pala yun, midges. Tagnok ko yan sa Tagalog. Tagnok. It's a small insect. It's the only pollinator of cacao and you cannot see that when you visit your farm. You can only feel it kasi kakagatin ka or pag matamaan sila ng araw, yun makikita, naglipad sila. Maliliit na insekto yan.
So, nawala po ulit si Sir Val. So, balikan po natin si Sir Val maya-maya. So, next, mag-entertain lang po tayo ulit ng isa pang question. So, for beginners or small cacao farmers, what is the most favorable variety aside from the commonly UF18 bar from the Caraga region?
Can I answer?
Ayan, ito po ulit si Sir Val. So, Sir Val.
Yes, ang UF18 kasi siyang pinakasikat na variety ngayon sa Pilipinas. You know why? Dahil malalaki siya na ang buto niya. Then if i-relate na large kasi yung size ng beans. Pag ang kasi natin, ang grade 1A natin is kailangan less than 100 beans per 100 grams. At saka UF18 usually kasi magwi-weigh lang siya ng
Meron ako. Hello, Sir Val. Medyo nawawala lang po yung sounds ni Sir Val. Baka po sa internet connection po. Hello, Sir Val. Sir, medyo hindi po naririnig yung audio po.
Nawala po ang audio ni Sir Val. So, yung mga questions po natin, siguro mamaya po natin sa kanya itanong after po nung discussion niya. So, ngayon po muna ay mag-menti quiz po muna tayo. So, Miss Brooke, nandyan ka na po ba? Ayan. So, thank you po, Miss Krish. Thank you po, Miss Krish, sa inyong pagbibigay ng oras para sa amin. Thank you po.